one of the early issues we see with customers is data management. So there's a variety of issues that we see, but oftentimes it's just difficult to get the data that is required.
Yeah.
So it's a long question, but I guess maybe let's talk about some of the issues we see first, and
Yep.
then maybe some of the best practices that people
Yep.
can try and improve now before they actually go seeking some
Yep.
new tools or technology.
Yeah. So a few extreme examples are, so the easiest one would be no data tracking at all, because you're starting from nothing and you can build from the ground up the right thing, trademark. Um, because if we're involved in the setting up a new data management system, regardless of if we implement the data management system or not, we can at least direct or make recommendations on what should be tracked and how.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other extreme we see is that we've been gathering data since forever, but then like the data gathering is not necessarily what's needed. There's like a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
things that needs to be reworked, and they're often tracked in legacy systems that are hard to connect with other external systems and so on. And so uh, this is not necessarily ideal. And the other extreme example we've had is when the data you need to have access to um, has many external players involved in the whole thing, where integration may or may not be entirely possible. And so the worst case we've seen is manually re-entering data from one system to another, which can lead to a whole bunch of problems, or having some sort of obscure mechanism to transfer data from one system to the next. And if you're not careful internally to train everyone who needs to interact with those systems in terms of how they're integrated together and who's responsible for what, then it can be messy. Now, in practice, if we go back to the example of those who have been tracking data for a while but not tracking it the right way, let's say, the main thing is that you need to be making a distinction between planning data and operational data. And most people will aggregate the two together. So the worst case we've seen is like salespeople are playing in the same database as the planning people. And so the system will not always be 100% aligned with the features that are required for each of those teams to be effective at their work. So they will all use sort of workarounds around the system. And those workarounds are hard to program or to extract and can be confusing or lead to inconsistent data. So one example would be a client is booking a flight and a return flight. So from the invoicing perspective, you want to book a trip that is a round trip, but the first leg might be a Monday and the returning trip might be a week later. And so it shows up in the database as one trip that starts, say, on a Monday and then the next Monday, but you won't be like landing the aircraft on destination and leave it there for a week. You'll fly it back through a dead end. And
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes you might like copy these two trips and create some sort of fake sales ID numbers. And then the planning team knows that these are the copies of the other trips. There's no data driven link between the two. And then we get that and things go wrong, obviously. So having a mechanism to either tag appropriately data from the sales front, the operational front, and the planning front, or having three different but connected systems is usually the way to go. And so when we see people who implement their own things in house, uh, they don't necessarily have the perspective or the step back to look at that from how this will go in the future with future systems and future technologies, and what traps and pitfalls can be avoided up front, which is not easy at all. Um, and the other constraint is that when this is built by an internal IT person or team, which is typically a person, these people will be overworked, and so there's some missing features, not because we don't know we need them, but because there's just no time to build those features.
Right. So I think another good example about the planned schedule versus operating schedule is, we've gone into companies and taken some historical data to do some analysis, and a constraint upon that analysis is, a 60-minute minimum turnaround time, but the actual operated schedule, because something got delayed, the real turnaround time was 5 minutes. And then it becomes very hard to compare the two schedules because the constraints are different, basically, even though that schedule was probably planned with 60-minute intervals. That data isn't stored, so you never see that. So, and then, I mean, other issues, even if you store data, if it's incorrect and that data gets passed to other tools, then those issues propagate down the line, so to
Exactly.
speak. So